So one of the things that Chapter 2 talks about is developing a classroom management plan. And while classroom management is really about procedures, routines, and expectations, and yes, behavior management is part of that, but it's not like the only piece of that, you know? And so a lot of this stuff is really just taking the stuff that we already know and already do in our regular classrooms and really kind of applying that into like a digital setting. And going over those and constantly rehearsing that. If you didn't do that early on, you're probably beating yourself over the head or having to revisit doing all of that. That's all probably stuff you guys have figured out over these last couple of weeks. My 5-year-old is muting and unmuting constantly because they're just practicing that in class. And you know, the catchphrase of 2020 is you're muted, right? I mean, how many times have we heard that or had to say that to somebody? I think I got a meme on that coming up early, a little bit later. Don't tell anybody that I spoiled that already. So I'm going to send you guys back into breakout rooms really quickly to kind of answer these 3 questions. Views and beliefs about teaching and learning, how that should look in your virtual classroom. What are your beliefs concerning community and diversity? And then this 3rd question is really going to be interesting because how will those views manifest themselves when students have ideas that run counter to yours? So you have this idea, you have this belief structure about how you want your classroom to be, and then you're gonna infuse that, you know, because all the educational theory in the world's fantastic, right? Until you get into a classroom. And then you're like, this isn't working, right? When theory meets practice, usually it involves a giant train wreck has been my experience, especially whenever I'm trying something new for the first time and I'm like, oh God, that was really, really, really bad. I remember the first time I did a Socratic seminar, and I think it was another 6 months before I tried to do another one, just because of how awful I had done with it. But, you know, you keep practicing and eventually we get good at it, right? All right, let's go ahead and send you guys back. They spent a lot of time in the book talking about norms, and I think one of the things that they said is that norms are going to have to talk about them or not. You know, it's just kind of like culture in terms of like what you allow in your house and what you allow in your classroom. Those things kind of develop. If you don't explicitly state them and model those things are going to come up and they're going to happen. And, you know, for better or worse. And sometimes it's better and sometimes it's worse. So one of the things that they had is they had these questions to kind of ponder about norms. And when I read these questions, somebody was laughing. I hope it's because you were like, oh, Cliff's Norm's best friend, right? Yeah. Like 3 people got my joke. I'm digging it. I appreciate it. So you'd be surprised at how hard I had to find a picture of Cliff and Norm without an adult beverage in their hand. It was quite the task. So I'm relatively happy that I was able to bring you guys that. Probably more time went into that than should have. And now I spend more time explaining it than I should have. But so they presented these questions about what we want in terms of our students. And it really kind of lends itself to this idea about expert learners. And I don't know if you guys have had a whole lot of conversations around this idea of generating expert learners or dependent learners in our classrooms. But I mean, ultimately, what we're trying to create is expert learners, this idea that we want our kids to be intellectually curious and they want to go out into the world and they want to answer these questions and they're able to do things on their own, right? For the sake of time, I'm not going to have you guys read a big old research article. I hope that you can trust that when I tell you this, that these are kind of facts, that these are some of the key things that are needed in terms of building an expert learner: goal setting, inquiry, transfer, formative assessment, choice, and reflection. Those are all things that we want our students to be able to do, and that in order for them to be able to do, we also need to be able to do these in order for us to grow as expert learners. Does that make sense? All right, so I'm gonna try something here. And you guys are gonna be my guinea pigs and hopefully it goes well. This is my take on a Google Jamboard. Are you guys familiar with Google Jamboards? All right, so we're going to do a Google Jamboard. And really what I want to, so you're going to go into your breakout rooms. And the first thing you're going to do is we're going to take a look at these Jamboards. And let me, I think I'm going to have to change my screen share real quick. Actually, no, I can do this. Are you now seeing the loading screen of my Jamboards? Okay, cool. So as these are loading up, we got an elementary, so expert learner ES and expert learner middle school. So I'll just open it up, and the Jamboard's really basic. It's got those 5 things, and I'm gonna throw it in the chat, but I'm gonna kind of bring you back and throw you back, like kind of like what I've been doing so far today. But I really just kind of want you to talk about where you are in your practice with these 5 different elements, with goal setting, within those categories. And so you're gonna grab a Post-it and you'll make it that color and you'll just drop it onto the Jamboard. If you've never used Google Jamboard, it's pretty simple. So you just grab a Post-it note, a sticky note, and then goal setting, set goals, you know, and you just type it in and then you can move them all around and you can place them wherever you want. I'm gonna go ahead and delete that since I made that and not you guys. But the first thing I want you to do is really just kind of have a question, like a conversation around where are you at in this process? Where is it that where your strengths lie in terms of these 5 different elements? And where is it that you struggle within those 5 different elements? All right. So you have access to the slides, so you can go back and take a look at what those are in case you're not familiar with any one of those particular that manifests itself in your classroom. And what is the weakness that you have amongst those 5 elements, and how hasn't it, or how has it, possibly how has it impaired your classroom, if it's impaired your classroom at all? Maybe you don't know because you're like, I didn't even know that I was supposed to be teaching for transfer. So I don't know how the lack of transfer teaching is impacting my class, obviously. But does that make sense? We're good? Yes, maybe? All right. So and Grace is dropping the links for the different Jamboards into the chat. You can go ahead and access those, and you have the links, obviously. And if you have the presentation, you can it can jump you into that as well. So come on in and join, and then I'm gonna move you again to breakout rooms. So it seems like the middle school, you guys have done a lot of work around expert learners and stuff. Would that be a fair and accurate statement? Maybe one head nod. Some people, no, not really. Are you guys familiar with the concept, or did I just say a word and assume that everybody knew what I was talking about without anybody really having any idea? Yes, that's what I did, and that's probably a bad thing on my part. All right, so let me backtrack for a minute, and then you guys were obviously able to work around with what those 5 words mean and what they are and how they go. So for the longest time in our classrooms, we're dealing with what we call dependent learners. You know, you give kids a task and the immediate question out of their mouth is, how many pages have to be? How many pages does it have to be? How long do I have to work till it's done, right? How many sentences, or how many, do I have to do all of the problems? Do I have to show all of my work? Whatever it happens to be, right? And so that's like that dependent learning mentality, where the teacher is needed to go ahead and tell them what they want to do. And so the idea now is to kind of shift from this mindset of students being dependent upon the teacher for instructions and guidance to move into this idea of cultivating and creating an expert learner. And an expert learner being someone who's taking responsibility for their own learning. You know, our students taking responsibility for their own learning and really going ahead and owning that learning, because it matters to them, and owning that learning because they can see the relevance to that, and utilizing those the different things that we talked about, you know, goal setting so that there's accountability in that process, utilizing inquiry so that students are out there searching for answers like they would have to do in the real world, like we have to do when we have problems and questions, right? And teaching for transfer, which is that idea of taking that learning and applying it in a new setting, so that way we can go ahead and build those synapses in the brain so that we can access that learning later. formative assessment with a huge focus on formative assessment as opposed to summative assessment, so that way we can make those guidances and make those small changes along the way. And then utilizing choice, and not choice for the sake of choice, like, ooh, we're going to give you 5 different choices of how you can go ahead and do that. But choice because there's a very famous TED Talk. It's called The Myth of Average. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but it talks about, I saw some head shaking no. So I'll just explain real quick. But the myth of average covers this idea that, like, back in the 1950s, I think it was the 1950s, they were making fighter pilots and cockpits, and our pilots were not that good, but they made a one-size-fits-all cockpit. And the way they did that is they based it off of the average military enlistment person. And the way they found what the average person was is they took measurements of everyone. They took your chest measurements, they took your arm measurements, your leg measurements. And so they knew that everyone, you know, that everyone fit this mythical average, but no one was average, because if you had long legs, you might have had a shorter torso, or you might have had long arms, but you had, you know, you had a shorter torso. And so as a result, like, people couldn't fly planes, they couldn't work really well within the military complex. And so what they did, some crazy work came out of this, and eventually we get things that we take for granted now, like adjustable seats, you know, seats that go forward and backwards and raise up and down. All of that idea came out because of this idea that our fighter pilots couldn't reach the cockpit, or couldn't go ahead and make the adjustments and get to their instrument panels. And so this idea, so taking that idea is that there's no average real person. There's no average student. You know, just because a student isn't a good reader doesn't mean that they're not a good critical thinker. And just because a student's not a good writer doesn't mean that they're not a good critical thinker. Or just because you can read doesn't necessarily mean that you can write. And because, you know, and so there's all of these different ideas that factor into learner variability. And so providing choice so that students can leverage their strengths or work on their weaknesses so that they can grow and improve as students. All right, and then a reflection piece at the end to go ahead and have students be able to reflect on their learning and their goal setting. Did they achieve those goals? So that way they can grow. I mean, honestly, when we go ahead and, you know, I had mentioned about failing at running a Socratic seminar the first time I had done it, and I wasn't ready to reflect right after that. You know, I was ready to go home and self-medicate because it was such a bad experience with, you know, and I did that for 5 periods of just boom, 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 getting beat up, and it was just did not work well, right? And I think we've all had that lesson plan blow up in our face, and then we either keep with it and then really hate our day, or we make those changes so that we can either adapt and grow, and hopefully it gets better by the end of the day, right? But really by being able to reflect on what it is that we did wrong or what we did poorly, so that way it can grow, and we can grow in that experience and get better. And so that's what that reflection piece is for. I'm going to keep you guys whole group now for this next piece. And it seemed like you guys did a lot with your Jamboards in terms of talking about what it is that you do well. And in elementary, we talked about what it was that where we're kind of at with ourselves in that process. And so I'm just kind of curious, how do you see these different things, you know, that we talked about connecting to each other? Are there connections to be made between these 6 different things?
Well, there definitely is a connection between your goal setting and then the formative assessment. Just trying to gauge exactly where you are in meeting that goal with each of the students.
Okay.
And I think with goal setting comes reflection, because you reflect on why you did or did not make your goal and what you need to do.
Okay.
Well, and I think once you've done your reflection and you've done, you know, your assessments, you can see if it's transferred or not, you know, to Because I think that's a piece a lot of us could probably work with. We taught it. It's good. Now, can they take that and put it in a different way? Can they, do something a little different with it? So.
Right. I know at the middle school and the high school level, when we're like in a history class, and because I'm a history teacher, so I'll tell you, what do you mean we have to write? This is history class. Like, what? No, we're not supposed to do that in here. And then it's like they got to be retaught, and they don't realize the skills that they learned in that one class, they can bring over and utilize in a different class.
I see a connection between inquiry and choice.
Mm-hmm.
Because if each child has their own question that they want to answer through research or whatever it is, then they are selecting how and designing ways to go through the inquiry process.
Excellent.
I feel like the biggest thing with all of this is like, I'm a newer teacher, so I obviously just finished school, and these are literally the basic components of like what needs to be completed in a unit or when you're designing instruction for students. All of these are things that make effective lessons and an effective unit for students to learn. So all of these have to be components in order for students to be successful, in order for me to be successful, and finding a way to actually fit them in so the students get like the entire experience of the unit, and that like constantly doing the formative assessment as you're going through with this whole goal in mind, and giving them those opportunities to explore what they're supposed to be learning in their goals and reflecting on those, and then just the process that they transfer that knowledge to other parts to make a bigger connection. So I feel like they're all linked together as a successful learning experience for students.
All right. I think that's a really great summarization of that. It's like a mic drop right there with the earbuds coming out. I'll call that good. So you guys can see that they are kind of linked together, that these things all kind of intertwine and they play together with each other. What I would encourage you guys to do is to look at one of the ones that you're not necessarily where you're not excelling, and maybe with your commitment partner that we kind of talked about yesterday, figure out a way that you can kind of start to infuse that process into your classroom. What is it that you can do to make that better? Does that make sense? We're running a little short on time, so I was going to have us talk about that, but I'm going to have you guys reflect on that kind of individually as we kind of move forward. Because I want to share some resources with you guys. So they talk about linking norms to classroom assignments, and then or linking norms to classroom agreements, because you want your class to kind of come up with these, and you want them to kind of take ownership of their learning and what learning goes on, and you want them to be a part of that process. This is an example that the book gives of peer learning norms. This is stuff that we all probably know about norms. Fewer is better. You want to co-construct them with students. You want to state them positively. In the absence of clear statements, students are left to speculate what is acceptable. And if you have a Don Powell in your class, if you tell, and you're a substitute teacher, and you tell Don Powell he can't get out of his desk again, or else he's going to get sent to the principal's office, Don Powell's going to pick up his desk and he's going to move it to his classmates so he can keep talking to them. Because you didn't tell me I couldn't do that, and I didn't get up out of my desk. So I was that kid. I'm sorry. And then, so you want them to be stated specifically. You want to post the agreements so students can see them. You could possibly make them part of your virtual background or your Bitmoji classroom. Teach and rehearse those expectations. Teach and model them during the first couple of weeks. And as you go ahead and recreate them, that thing is huge, teaching and going through that process. And I know, because I was an avid teacher for a long time, and I'm telling you, we spend a day out of the year, every single year, organizing our desks into tutorials. So that way we can move and get out of tutorials within a 2 to 5 minute, like 3 minutes tops is what we aimed for. And it had to be like that. Otherwise, kids would take 20 minutes to try to organize their desks in a semicircle. It's kind of like one of those things, if you give them 20 minutes, they'll take 20 minutes. If you give them 5, they'll take 5. So you don't want rules to be compliance-based because it gives across this idea that they better listen or else. You want to try to avoid muting students that are talking or that are causing distraction, because what it does is it creates what you have to say is not important. I'm sorry, I'm stopping you. I'm in charge here and we need to get going. And so it creates a problem for re-engaging, especially at a distance. Modeling behavior, what should look like. Your role is to foster learning, not controlling and confining them. And you can show that by having positive rules as opposed to negative rules. They say that there's a ton of research out there that's saying that co-constructing agreements and doing that at the middle and high school level is actually really good for students. There's a link that is lesson plans for creating classroom agreements that infuses history, social science. So you're looking at and has kids talking about rules that they liked. I don't have them for 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade because I didn't have a primary source document to link them to. But essentially, there's several days worth of talking about, what's the dumbest rule that a kid has ever had to experience. My 5-year-old says the dumbest rule that he ever saw was why we can't eat outside in the rain. Then he thought about it and he was like, well, I guess it kind of makes sense because your food gets wet and soggy. So, I mean, kids even at that age are cognitively aware of rules and they're thinking about why are they good or why are they bad. And trust me, I mean, we've all seen some pretty dumb rules in our lifetime, right? And so allowing students to talk about that, allowing students to talk about good rules, and so that way they can kind of create the rules that they want.
Hey, Don.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but can you
you're
put
good.
it into present mode so that we can see the slides a little better?
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry. I didn't realize that they were that much smaller because you couldn't see. All right. Thank you for letting me know that. Can you guys see now? Cool. So obviously cameras are great for synchronous learning because you can see and you can, I'm a big fan of it because I can get a feel for my audience and where people are at and things like that. But the book talked about this fact about 20% of our students being Muslim across the nation. I don't know what it's going to be like in your district, but they allude to this idea that women don't wear the hijab inside of their home. And so now all of a sudden, if I put my camera on and I force my kid to, they now have to put a hijab on. And if someone's going to walk in that area, they're going to have to put all the women in the house are going to have to do that. So it can create issues that we didn't really think about. And then, not all families have white picket fences. I don't have a white picket fence, but I mean, I live in a pretty nice neighborhood right now. But you guys probably know better than most that there are some of our students that are not coming, touching back from yesterday, that are coming from traumatic places, and school was their outlet. And so for them to go ahead and to have to unmute, there was just this story the other day about a teacher who asked her kids to unmute. And in the moment that little girl unmuted, the mom yelled at the dad to go F yourself as loud as can be. And that went out over Zoom. And so it's just like, oh my God, and that kid muted back and didn't come back for the rest of the day. And it's just like these little nuances that we don't necessarily think about. So if a kid isn't muted, if a kid is muted, or if a kid doesn't have their picture up, there might be a reason for that. And maybe we should explore that, going back to that whole compassion piece. These are tips for students really about things that they want. And I think that those tips also apply to us as teachers, things that we want as we get ready for our classrooms. And then making sure about the lighting, having that first and last name. So that way you can greet everybody by name. And then you can learn if you're mispronouncing names. Isn't that right? Anna E, did I say that right? See? And it's because we asking clarifying questions, using reaction buttons, hand raising, ways to continue to get kids engaged. The importance of muting our microphone. We had that issue yesterday where we had that feedback or something was going on. And then notifications. Unfortunately, you guys saw my notifications popping up all day yesterday. I think I fixed that for today, hopefully. And then some great muted memes that you can use in your virtual settings. reviewing your goals, asking those clarifying questions, and making sure that they know how to access assigned homework and stuff. Developing organizational and procedural routines, having these and weekly and monthly schedules so the families can have access to that. And then teaching students what signals you'll use, smooth transitions, minimize behavior difficulties. You know, and if you have a behavioral disability, if we're able to manage the transitions better and utilize verbal cues as well as visual cues, it can help those students as well as their students who are English learners, so that they may not have the language, but they'll pick up on the cues. You know, kind of like it's a bad way of saying it, but it works, like the Pavlovian dog example. You know, we ring the bell and all of a sudden we know that we're getting food. So we ring the bell and we know that we're moving on to the next activity. Elapsed timers are really great for countdowns. I mean, you can just Google them and then that's a whole list of those that just popped up. Clearly labeling digital folders, identifying stuff that needs to be printed in advance. And then you're obviously going to want to keep that to an absolute minimum because not all of our students have access to printers. Creating for procedures for how students are going to submit assignments. You know, Google Classroom helps with a lot of this, but all of a sudden, if you get 50 papers in that all say term paper, it's going to be really hard for you to find the term paper that you're looking for if they're not submitting on Google Classroom, or if your LMS doesn't have a housing area that helps sort that process, or if your inbox gets filled with things that say term paper. And so what I really liked about this is this was a great example that the book had, but it had a great example and non-example. And anytime you're teaching with students, the more you can have examples and non-examples, and the non-examples come just naturally, because if you're not, you know, going back to that idea of teacher clarity, if you're not super clear in your directions, you're going to get some non-examples that roll in, and you're going to be like, okay, so that was because I wasn't clear in my instructions, or maybe you were, but then you can create this kind of a chart and be like, so this is a non-example, these are non-examples, and here's why they're non-examples, and examples of what it is that you want. Considerate websites, these are the things that you're looking for in terms of designing a considerate website. If you're building a class website, if you haven't already done so, if you're a nerd and you're into web content accessibility guidelines, that's the latest and greatest that's out there in terms of what they need to be: perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. Things that you should think about when you're designing your website, having your landing page, what should be on your landing page. You know, you don't want to have distracting backgrounds or things that make things harder to read. And less is more, typically. I mean, we generally cram a lot of information onto a web page, and so these are all things that you might want to consider. Things for your student page, things that you have on your family page. This page right here, Grace is going to drop several of these links in the chat. So this FAQ page actually opens up to a whole host of teacher tutorials on how to use tons, and I mean tons, of the digital services that are out there. And the cool thing is, Grace is also going to drop into the fact there's a student and teacher component of that as well. Like there's a student and parent component as to how to use each of those different tools. And then one of my coworkers actually translated the student and teacher component FAQ into, or tutorials into Spanish. I don't know why I couldn't say that just now. When you go to click on that link, it'll go to it'll have you make copies of that, but I highly recommend you check it out. It's got a ton of great resources. I'm trying to whiz through this so that way you guys can be done. But we're talking about Chrome, Chromebook, Drive, Slides, Sheets, Zoom, all kinds of things. These are some places where you can go to build websites. I got to be honest with you. I went through and I used to use Weebly back when I was a teacher, where it says example Weebly. If you click on that, you can see my old high school webpage. That's what I posted. It's about 10 years out of date, but that's what I had used. And then if you click on example Wix, I'm not even kidding you, it kind of made something really nice in the 3 minutes that it took me to go ahead and create. So And I was actually really impressed with that. And it was just like a 5-minute thing, and then it really knocked something out. And then there's Google Sites, and these are like just some of the better web LMSs out there. Talks about greeting students as well, and the importance of that, and that we got to greet them every day. You know, you say hello to your significant. You didn't say hello to your significant other, or you may have said hello to your significant other yesterday, so you don't have to say hello to them today. You don't think like that, and if you do think like that and you act like that, they're probably not going to be your significant other for very long, right? I know that, yeah, you can get it. We get into trouble for that, especially guys. I don't know if it's especially guys. I just know that I have. And so we got to apply that rule to our students, and we got to make sure that we're saying hello to them every day. So, and you can personalize the space. If you notice up in the upper right-hand corner, there's a word cloud. That's everybody who registered for our event. And so you can see everybody's name up there. And it was really easy. You just go to wordclouds.com and you can put that together. And it's interesting because you can use that with like different assignments and have kids post into that. And what it does is the names or the words that get used the most often become bigger and more robust. And so you can kind of see how that works, and you can arrange them into different shapes. I arranged that to look like a bat, because if you have to be someone, you should be yourself. Unless you can be Batman, then you should always be Batman. All right. Capitalizing on student interests, learning about student interests, and utilizing that inside of your classroom, and not necessarily just doing that in terms of in a classroom setting, but you can go to a kid and ask them like, hey, I know you're a gamer. You know, what should I get my nephew or my cousin or my son for Christmas in terms of video games? Or tell me about this trick that you're learning on your skateboard. All kinds of things that the book talks about that hopefully we know, and if we don't know, we can kind of, it's always nice to have that reminder. I have the picture of the ice there because this was literally the icebreaker that we did in the beginning, and it was so that we could generate ideas and learn about each other. Learning student interest is important. This talks about some things you can do with elementary students in terms of singing and clapping their names. I have learned in my tenure as a high school teacher that anything elementary school teachers do, high school kids love. Reading on the carpet, gold stars, stickers. It's ridiculous, like what kids will do for a sticker or an eraser. We're out of time, but we created a Padlet so that way we can talk about learning about student interests and best ways to do that. I'm sorry that we didn't get a chance to get to that. Again, school reopening resources, remote learning resources, John Omerode again. And then we also, if you're interested in virtual professional learning for your site, for your district, for your school, we've got a link for that as well. And if you're interested in virtual coaching, we do that as well. Wanted to put that link in there. And then obviously we got a new Dilbert cartoon, and I hope you guys can fill out the evals.